The millionaire sees a boy stealing soil from his garden and asks him, "Why are you doing that?" The boy replies with a phrase that leaves the millionaire speechless. "I'm collecting it to bury my mother and sister." Not knowing how to react, he decides to investigate further. What he discovers changes everyone's life, including his own. Watch this beautiful story of overcoming to the end. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like this video and tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. Alexander Morgan stood at his penthouse window, his reflection ghosting against the panoramic view of the city below. The early morning fog wrapped around the skyscrapers like a silk scarf, obscuring the boundaries between heaven and earth. At 45, he had mastered the art of turning opportunities into gold, but lately the victory felt hollow. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble floor as he made his way to his morning ritual, a solitary breakfast on his garden terrace. The garden was his sanctuary, a meticulously maintained half-acre of paradise 30 stories above, the chaos of downtown. Every morning his gardener would ensure each leaf was in its proper place, each flower blooming according to schedule. It was perfect, predictable, and utterly under his control, just the way he liked everything in his life. But this morning was different. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows he spotted something out of place, a small figure hunched over his prized flower beds. Alexander's first instinct was to call security, but something made him pause. The figure was too small to be a threat, and its movement seemed desperate rather than destructive. He watched as the child, he could see now it was a boy, scooped handfuls of rich black soil into a cracked bucket. The boy's clothes hung loose on his thin frame, his hands bare despite the biting cold of the early spring morning. The security guard at the garden's entrance had noticed too and was reaching for his radio, but Alexander held up his hand, signaling him to wait. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something stir inside him, curiosity perhaps, or something deeper he couldn't quite name. He made his way down the carved stone steps to his garden, his expensive suit catching the morning dew. The boy didn't notice his approach, too focused on his task, his small hands working with determined precision. "Why are you taking my soil?" Alexander asked, keeping his voice neutral, neither threatening nor friendly. The boy looked up, and Alexander felt something shift in his carefully ordered world. The child's eyes weren't filled with fear or guilt, as he'd expected. Instead, they held a fierce determination that seemed too old for his young face. Dirt smudged his cheeks, but his gaze was steady, unwavering. "I need it to bury my mother and sister," the boy replied, his voice clear and direct despite the weight of his words. Alexander had navigated hostile takeovers, faced down boards, eyed directors, and closed billion-dollar deals without flinching. But these simple words from a child's mouth struck him speechless. The carefully constructed walls of his world began to crack, letting in something he'd spent years keeping at bay, raw, unfiltered reality. "What's your name?" he finally managed to ask, lowering himself to one knee despite his expensive suit. "Tommy," the boy answered, still clutching his bucket of soil. "Tommy Martinez." The name hung in the air between them, a bridge between two worlds that should never have intersected. Alexander looked at the soil in the bucket, soil he'd had specially imported from the finest suppliers, soil that cost more per pound than some people made in a day. Now it was being collected to serve a purpose he could never have imagined. "Tell me more, Tommy," Alexander said, making a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. He gestured to a nearby bench carved from Italian marble. "Tell me everything." As Tommy began to speak, the morning sun broke through the fog, casting long shadows across the immaculate garden. Below them, the city was awakening, unaware that, in this perfectly manicured sanctuary high above its streets, a story was beginning that would shake its foundations. The boy's words tumbled out, a story of loss and desperation that seemed impossible in a city of such wealth. His mother and sister, their struggle with illness, the system that had failed them, and now his desperate attempt to give them dignity in their final rest. With each word, Alexander felt the familiar parameters of his world shifting, realigning. themselves around this new reality he'd stumbled into. As Tommy's story unfolded, Alexander found himself drawn into a world he'd only seen through the tinted windows of his luxury cars. The boy spoke of his grandmother, Eleanor, who had taken them in when things got bad. They lived in the shadows, a makeshift community on the outskirts of the city's prosperity, where survival was a daily negotiation with fate. "Grandma Elena tries," Tommy said, his small fingers tracing patterns in the remaining soil. "She works cleaning houses, but it's not enough. When Mom got sick, we couldn't afford the medicine. The hospital," his voice trailed off, heavy with memories too dark for his young shoulders to bear. Alexander listened, each word a hammer blow to the carefully constructed walls of his worldview. He'd built hospitals, funded medical research, but somehow had never considered what happened to those who couldn't access any of it. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent millions creating healing spaces that people like Tommy's family couldn't enter. "Stay here," Alexander said suddenly, standing up. "I'm going to get someone to help us figure this out." He walked briskly to his private elevator, pressing the button for his office floor. His mind was already racing ahead, forming plans, making connections. Maria, his most trusted assistant for the past decade, looked up in surprise as he burst through the door. "Cancel my meetings for the day," he instructed, already reaching for his phone, "and get me everything you can find about the Shadows community. Also, I need our legal team on standby." Maria's eyebrows rose slightly, but she knew better than to question him when he had that look in his eyes. "Of course, Mr. Morgan. Anything else?" "Yes, send someone to get food, enough for a child and an elderly woman, and have housekeeping prepare the guest suite in the East Wing." When Alexander returned to the garden, he half expected Tommy to be gone. But the boy was still there, sitting exactly where he'd left him, as if he'd somehow sensed that this moment was too important to flee from. "Tommy," Alexander said, settling back onto the bench. "I want to help, not just with the soil, but with everything. Will you let me?" The boy studied him with those old eyes in a young face. "Why?" It was a fair question, one that Alexander wasn't entirely sure he could answer. Why indeed? He'd spent years building walls between himself and the messy realities of the world below. Yet here he was, ready to tear them down for a child he'd met an hour ago. "Because sometimes life gives us chances to make things right," he finally said, "and I think this is one of those chances." Tommy nodded slowly, as if weighing the truth of these words. "But what about my sister? She's still—" He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "Tell me where she is," Alexander said gently. "We'll figure this out together." As Tommy began to share more details, Alexander's phone buzzed with incoming messages. Maria had already begun gathering information about the Shadows, and what she'd found was both enlightening and disturbing. The community had been formed when the city's housing crisis reached its peak, a collection of forgotten people making homes in the shadows of luxury developments, some of which Alexander's own company had built. The irony of it all wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years creating spaces that pushed people like Tommy's family further into the margins, all while convincing himself he was contributing to the city's progress. Now, sitting in his perfectly manicured garden with a boy who had come to steal soil for the most heartbreaking of reasons, he realized how blind he'd been. "Mr. Morgan." Tommy's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Are you really going to help?" Alexander looked at the boy, seeing not just Tommy, but all the other children like him, invisible to the world of board meetings and billion-dollar deals. "Yes, Tommy. I'm going to help. And not just you. But first, we need to take care of your family." As if on cue, Maria appeared at the garden entrance, carrying bags of food and necessities. Behind her, a team of staff members waited discreetly, ready to turn Alexander's impromptu plans into reality. The wheels were already in motion, setting in place a chain of events that would change not just Tommy's life, but the entire city's landscape. The next 24 hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Alexander's penthouse, usually a testament to minimalist luxury, transformed into a command center of sorts. Maria had assembled a team of lawyers, social workers, and healthcare professionals, all working discreetly under strict non-disclosure agreements. What they uncovered made Alexander's blood run cold. Tommy's sister, Isabella, wasn't gone as initially believed. She was alive, but barely holding on in an underfunded shelter on the city's outskirts. The facility, if it could even be called that, was operating on a shoestring budget, providing minimal care to children with severe medical needs. Isabella's condition, a rare degenerative disorder, required specialized care that the shelter couldn't possibly provide. Mr. Morgan, Dr. Sarah Chen, a pediatric specialist he'd called in, pulled him aside after reviewing Isabella's medical records. This child needs immediate intervention. The fact that she survived this long is nothing short of miraculous. Alexander nodded, his jaw set in determination. What do we need? Everything. Proper medical equipment, specialized therapy, nutrition. She hesitated. But there's something else you should know. The hospital that turned away their mother. They had an obligation to treat her. What they did wasn't just unethical. It was illegal. The revelation sent ripples through Alexander's carefully ordered world. He'd sat on charity boards with that hospital's directors, attended their fundraising galas, even contributed to their new wing. The hypocrisy of it all made him feel physically ill. Tommy, who had been sleeping in the guest suite, emerged to find Alexander staring out at the city skyline. The boy had cleaned up, wearing new clothes that Maria had quickly procured, but his eyes still held that same determined look. "You found something about Isabella, didn't you?" Tommy asked, his voice small but steady. Alexander turned, studying the boy who had unwittingly sparked what was becoming a major investigation. "Yes, Tommy, and I promise you, we're going to help her. But I need you to tell me more about what happened at the hospital with your mother." As Tommy began to speak, Alexander's personal assistant quietly recorded every detail. The story that emerged was one of systematic failure. A mother repeatedly turned away despite obvious symptoms, documentation requirements used as barriers, and finally a tragic end that could have been prevented. "Mom kept all the papers," Tommy said, his voice catching. "She said we might need them someday. They're in a box under her bed at Grandma Elena's." Alexander exchanged glances with his legal team. Those documents could change everything. "Tommy, would you be willing to take us to your grandmother's place? We need to talk to her and get those papers." The boy nodded, but then hesitated. "Will you really help Isabella? The doctors before, they said she needed special medicine, but we couldn't." "Yes," Alexander interrupted, his voice firm. "I'm going to help Isabella, and I'm going to make sure what happened to your mother never happens to anyone else again." The trip to the shadows was eye-opening. Alexander's luxury SUV seemed obscenely out of place among the makeshift homes and narrow alleys. Tommy directed them through a maze of passages until they reached a small, well-maintained structure that somehow managed to look dignified despite its humble materials. Elena Martinez opened the door before they could knock. She was a small woman, but her presence filled the doorway. Her eyes, so like Tommy's, sized up Alexander with a mixture of suspicion and hope. "Abuela," Tommy said, rushing to hug her. "He's going to help Isabella." Elena's face softened at her grandson's words, but her gaze remained steady on Alexander. "Many people have promised to help, Senor, but promises are easy to make and hard to keep." Alexander stepped forward, meeting her gaze. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm not here just to make promises. I'm here to make things right, not just for your family, but for everyone who's been ignored by a system that I, in my own way, helped create." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Come in then, we have much to discuss." As they entered the modest home, Alexander noticed the careful organization, the spotless surfaces, the small touches that transformed a shelter into a home. On a small table, surrounded by candles, sat a photograph of a young woman with Tommy's eyes and Isabella's smile, their mother, forever frozen in a moment of happiness. The documents Elena produced from beneath her bed told a story more damning than anyone could have anticipated. Carefully preserved in a plastic folder were medical records, rejected application forms, and most crucially, a series of increasingly desperate emails to hospital administrators begging for help. Each piece of paper was a testament to a system that had failed this family at every turn. Alexander's legal team worked through the night, building a case that would shake the city's medical establishment to its core. But as dawn broke, bringing with it the first news cycle, things took an unexpected turn. "Mr. Morgan," Maria burst into his office, tablet in hand, "you need to see this." The local news website's headline made his heart sink. "Billionaires, strange behavior, Morgan seen with unknown child in troubled neighborhood." The article was filled with speculation and thinly veiled accusations, suggesting everything from a mental breakdown to a publicity stunt. "It gets worse," Maria continued, scrolling through her tablet. "Your board members are calling an emergency meeting. They're concerned about the company's image." Alexander laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "The company's image? While children like Isabella are suffering in substandard facilities." But he knew this was just the beginning. His world, the world of corporate boardrooms and shareholder meetings, operated on its own logic, one that often had little to do with human suffering or justice. The emergency board meeting was exactly as contentious as he'd expected. Alexander sat at the head of the conference table, facing the concerned faces of his board members, people he'd worked with for years. "Alex, be reasonable," Richard Bradford, his longtime friend and fellow board member, pleaded. "We understand you want to help, but this crusade could damage everything we've built." "Everything we've built," Alexander repeated, his voice quiet but intense. "What exactly have we built, Richard? Luxury developments that push people like the Martinez family further into the shadows? Hospitals that turn away sick children because their parents can't navigate the paperwork?" The room fell silent. Alexander stood, straightening his tie. "I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you what's going to happen. We're going to help Isabella Martinez get the medical care she needs, and then we're going to make sure no other family goes through what theirs did." "The shareholders won't stand for this," another board member warned. "Then let them sell," Alexander replied. "I'll buy their shares myself if I have to." As he left the boardroom, his phone buzzed with a message from Elena. Isabella had taken a turn for the worse at the shelter. The medical team Alexander had assembled was already en route, but the shelter's administration was refusing to release her without proper documentation. The irony of bureaucracy becoming a barrier once again wasn't lost on him. "Maria," he called out as he strode through the office, "get me Judge Henderson on the phone. We need an emergency custody order." But as they worked to navigate the legal maze, social media had picked up the story. Morgan's madness was trending, with opinions split between those who saw him as a hero and those who questioned his mental state. A notification popped up on his phone, an email from his biggest investor threatening to pull out if he didn't return to rational behavior. The stock price of his company had dropped 15% in a single day. Yet none of it mattered as much as the text message that followed. "Isabella is being transferred to Metropolitan Hospital. Emergency admission approved." Alexander smiled, remembering Tommy's words from their first meeting in the garden. The boy had come looking for soil to bury his loved ones, but instead had unearthed something far more significant: the buried conscience of a man who had everything and nothing at the same time. His phone rang again. It was Elena. "Mr. Morgan," her voice was tight with emotion, "the doctors say if we had waited another day." "But we didn't wait," Alexander interrupted gently. "And we won't wait anymore. Not for Isabella, not for anyone. Ali." He ended the call. His assistant appeared with more urgent messages from board members and investors. Alexander waved them away. Let them worry about stock prices and public image. He had more important matters to attend to. The storm was just beginning, but for the first time in years, Alexander Morgan felt truly alive. He had spent his life building walls of wealth and privilege, never realizing that they had become his prison. Now, thanks to a boy's desperate act in his garden, those walls were crumbling, and he had no intention of rebuilding them. The Metropolitan Hospital's private wing was a stark contrast to the shelter where Isabella had been languishing. State-of-the-art equipment hummed softly, monitoring every aspect of her condition. Dr. Chen had assembled a team of specialists who worked around the clock, determined to reverse months of inadequate care. Tommy sat by his sister's bedside, reading to her from a stack of books Maria had brought. The change in him was subtle but noticeable. His shoulders weren't quite as tense, his eyes held a glimmer of hope. Eleanor dozed in a comfortable chair nearby, exhaustion finally overtaking her vigilance. Alexander watched them through the glass wall of Isabella's room, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. The media circus outside the hospital had grown, with reporters camping out in the parking lot, hungry for any snippet of information about the billionaire's mysterious involvement with this family. "Mr. Morgan?" A quiet voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Sarah Williams, one of the hospital's senior social workers. "We need to talk about something important." They moved to a private consultation room where Sarah spread out a series of files on the table. "We've been looking into similar cases following your request," she began. "What we've found, it's not just the Martinez family, there's a pattern here." The files told stories painfully similar to Tommy's family. People turned away from medical care due to bureaucratic barriers, families torn apart by preventable health crises. Each case represented a failure of the system, a life altered or lost due to institutional indifference. "How many?" Alexander asked, his voice tight. "In the past year alone, over 300 documented cases, and those are just the ones we know about." Alexander stood, pacing the small room. "And the hospital board? They're claiming these are isolated incidents, administrative oversights." Sarah's voice held a note of controlled anger. "But the pattern is clear. These weren't mistakes. This was policy." As if to underscore the point, Alexander's phone buzzed with a news alert. The hospital's board had released a statement defending their admission practices and subtly suggesting that Alexander's interest in the Martinez case was emotionally driven and potentially destabilizing to the healthcare system. He was about to respond when another message came through, this one from his company's board of directors. They had called an emergency shareholder meeting. The subject, his removal as CEO. "Mr. Morgan?" Sarah watched him with concern. "Are you all right?" He smiled, a genuine smile that surprised them both. "I'm better than all right, Sarah. I'm finally seeing things clearly." Returning to Isabella's room, he found Tommy awake and alert. The boy had developed an uncanny ability to read Alexander's moods over the past few days. "Something's wrong," Tommy stated, not asking. Alexander sat beside him, careful not to disturb Elena's much-needed rest. "Not wrong exactly, but things are going to change. Remember when you told me about collecting soil from my garden? How desperate you felt, but also how determined." Tommy nodded, his eyes serious. "Well, sometimes adults need to be reminded of that kind of determination. Sometimes we get so caught up in our comfortable lives that we forget what really matters." Through the window, they could see the gathered media, their cameras and microphones like weapons pointed at the hospital entrance. Above them, the hospital's impressive facade bore the names of donors, including Alexander's own family name from a wing he'd funded years ago. "They're going to try to stop us, aren't they?" Tommy asked, showing that preternatural perception that still caught Alexander off guard. "They'll try," Alexander agreed. "But here's something I've learned from you, Tommy. Sometimes the most important things we do are the ones that seem impossible at first." A knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Chen entered, carrying test results and a cautiously optimistic expression. "Isabella's responding to treatment," she announced. "It's early, but the signs are promising." Elena stirred at the news, years of worry etched in the lines of her face. "Truly?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Dr. Chen confirmed. "Your granddaughter is a fighter." Alexander watched the hope bloom on their faces, and in that moment made a decision that would change not just his life, but the lives of countless others. He pulled out his phone and began typing an email to his board of directors. They wanted to remove him as CEO. Fine. He had bigger plans anyway. The email was brief but clear. He would sell his controlling shares in the company, all of them. The billions he would receive would fund something new, something that would ensure no other family would have to suffer like the Martinezes had. As he hit send, Tommy's hand slipped into his. The boy didn't say anything, but his grip was firm, supportive. Somehow this child who had started all this by stealing soil from his garden had become his strongest ally in a battle he hadn't even known he needed to fight. The news of Alexander Morgan's decision to sell his shares hit the financial world like a tsunami. Stock markets fluctuated wildly as speculators tried to predict the impact of his departure from the corporate empire he'd built. The business channels ran endless analyses, with experts debating whether this was a brilliant strategic move or the final evidence of a powerful man's public breakdown. But in Isabella's hospital room, none of that mattered. The little girl was growing stronger each day, her recovery defying the grim predictions that had haunted her family for so long. Tommy had taken to keeping a journal of her progress, meticulously, recording every smile, every new word, every small victory. "Mr. Morgan," Elena called out one morning as he arrived for his daily visit. "Look what my granddaughter did today." Isabella, sitting up in bed, had drawn a picture. In childish strokes, she'd created a garden filled with flowers, with 3 figures standing in it. Herself, Tommy, and a tall man in a suit who could only be Alexander. "She remembers," Tommy explained, his voice full of wonder. "She remembers the story I told her about your garden." Alexander carefully took the drawing, something catching in his throat. The garden in Isabella's imagination was wild and free, nothing like the manicured perfection he'd once prized. Somehow that felt exactly right. But outside the bubble of Isabella's recovery, forces were gathering. Alexander's former board members had launched a PR campaign questioning his mental stability. Old rivals emerged from the woodwork, eager to capitalize on his apparent downfall. Even some of his closest friends distanced themselves, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. Maria entered the room, her usual composed demeanor slightly ruffled. "Sir, there's something you need to see." She handed him her tablet, open to a breaking news story. The hospital board had launched an internal investigation, not into their own practices, but into the circumstances surrounding Isabella's admission. They were suggesting that proper protocols had been bypassed, that preferential treatment had been given due to Alexander's influence. "They're trying to discredit everything," Maria said quietly. "They're painting you as a rich man who thinks rules don't apply to him." Alexander handed the tablet back, a strange calm settling over him. "They're right about one thing. I don't think their rules should apply. Not when those rules value paperwork over people's lives." He turned to Tommy, who was watching the exchange with those 2 wise eyes. "Remember when you first came to my garden? You broke the rules too. Sometimes that's what it takes to do what's right." Elena stood, her small frame straight with dignity. "Mr. Morgan, perhaps it would be better if you stepped back. We are grateful for everything, but we don't want to cause you more trouble." "Mrs. Martinez," Alexander replied, "trouble isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it's exactly what we need to wake us up." As if to prove his point, his phone buzzed with another message. The shareholders' meeting had been moved up. They weren't just trying to remove him as CEO anymore. They wanted to force him to sell his shares at a reduced price, citing company bylaws about mental competency. But they'd underestimated him. While they'd been plotting his removal, he'd been working with a different team: social workers, healthcare advocates, community organizers, people who understood that real value wasn't measured in stock prices. "Tommy," he said, turning to the boy, "would you and your grandmother be willing to help me with something important?" Tommy nodded without hesitation. Elena took longer, studying Alexander's face before slowly nodding as well. "Good," Alexander smiled, "because I think it's time we showed everyone what really matters, not just for Isabella, but for all the other families out there who need help." He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd been saving for the right moment. "Ms. Roberts? It's Alexander Morgan. I think it's time for that interview you requested. But I have some conditions, and some people I'd like you to meet." The plan forming in his mind was audacious, perhaps even reckless. But looking at Isabella's drawing, at Tommy's determined face, at Elena's quiet strength, he knew it was the right thing to do. The garden that had once been his sanctuary had led him to a different kind of growing, one that couldn't be contained by marble walls or corporate boardrooms. The interview was set for prime time, but Alexander had insisted on an unconventional location. Instead of a sleek studio or his luxurious penthouse, Diana Roberts found herself setting up in the community center of the Shadows. The contrast between her designer suit and the humble surroundings wasn't lost on her viewers. "Mr. Morgan," Diana began once the cameras were rolling, "many people are questioning your recent actions. Your company's stock has plummeted, your board is moving to remove you, and there are suggestions that you're having some sort of breakdown. How do you respond to these concerns?" Alexander, sitting in a simple folding chair, smiled. "I think the better question, Diana, is why we're here. Why this location?" He gestured around the room where families from the Shadows had gathered. Among them were faces that told stories similar to the Martinez families, parents who had been denied medical care, children who had suffered needlessly, elderly who had been forgotten by the system. "These people," Alexander continued, "are the reason we're here. Their stories need to be heard." Eleanor stepped forward, Tommy at her side. With quiet dignity, she began to share their story, not just about Isabella, but about her daughter, about the system that had failed them, about the countless others who had faced similar struggles. As she spoke, other community members stepped forward. A father who had lost his job after missing work to care for his sick child. A grandmother who had been turned away from emergency care because of incomplete paperwork. A young mother who had been forced to choose between buying medicine and paying rent. Diana's professional detachment began to crack as the stories mounted. Her questions became more pointed, more focused on the systemic failures than on Alexander's supposed instability. "What these families have endured," Alexander said, his voice firm, "isn't just a tragedy. It's a failure of the system I helped build. Yes, I'm selling my shares. Yes, I'm walking away from the corporate world. But I'm not having a breakdown. I'm finally waking up." He revealed his plan. The billions from his sold shares would fund a new kind of healthcare initiative. Not just another charity, but a complete reimagining of how healthcare could work for underserved communities. "The first center will be right here," he announced, pulling out architectural plans, "in the Shadows, where it's needed most." The camera panned to show the blueprints, a modern medical facility integrated with community spaces, educational centers, and support services. But what caught everyone's attention was the name, the Martinez Community Health Center. Tommy, who had been quietly observing, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Morgan didn't just help my sister," he said, his clear voice carrying across the room. "He showed us that sometimes the people you think won't help you are the ones who care the most." Diana turned to her camera operator, signaling him to zoom in on Tommy. "Young man, you were the one who started all this, weren't you? By taking soil from Mr. Morgan's garden." Tommy nodded, but Alexander interjected gently. "He didn't just take soil, Diana. He planted something far more important, the seed of change." The interview continued, but something had shifted. The narrative was no longer about a billionaire's supposed breakdown. It was about a community finding its voice, about systemic change, about hope taking root in unexpected places. As the cameras finally stopped rolling, Diana approached Alexander. "Privately, this isn't going to make your corporate problems go away," she warned. "If anything, it might make them worse." Alexander watched as Tommy helped Elena gather her things, as community members hugged and shared contact information, as hope began to replace resignation in their eyes. "You know what I've learned, Diana? Sometimes the biggest problems we face aren't really problems at all. They're opportunities we've been too blind to see." Outside, the sun was setting over the Shadows, casting long rays across the vacant lot where the new health center would stand. Already, community members were gathering there, discussing plans, sharing ideas, daring to imagine a different future. The interview's impact was immediate and far-reaching. Within hours, social media exploded with reactions. The hashtag #DaunchenShadows2Light began trending, with people sharing their own stories of healthcare inequality. The narrative was shifting, and even Alexander's corporate opponents found themselves on the defensive. But the real change was happening on a more personal level. Isabella, watching the interview from her hospital room, had squeezed Tommy's hand when she saw herself in the architectural renderings. "Our name," she whispered, her voice growing stronger each day. "They're using our name to help people." The E. Hospital administration, which had been so eager to investigate Isabella's admission, suddenly found themselves under intense public scrutiny. Anonymous sources began leaking internal documents, revealing patterns of discrimination that could no longer be ignored. "Mr. Morgan," Dr. Chen reported during her morning rounds, "we've had 17 other facilities reach out since the interview. They want to know more about implementing similar programs." Alexander, who had barely slept in days, was reviewing proposals with his new team when Maria interrupted with urgent news. The shareholders' meeting had been cancelled. Instead, the board was requesting a private meeting with him. "They're scared," Maria observed, scanning through the morning's financial reports. "Your interview changed the conversation. They're not just facing a PR problem anymore, they're facing a moral reckoning." Alexander straightened his tie, preparing for the meeting. "Good, it's about time." But before he could leave, Tommy appeared at his office door. The boy had become a frequent visitor to the temporary headquarters Alexander had set up near the shadows. "Are you going to fight with them again?" Tommy asked, his perception razor-sharp as always. Alexander knelt to meet the boy's eyes. "Not. Fight, Tommy. Sometimes when people are scared of change, they need someone to show them why it's necessary." Tommy considered this, "Like when you didn't call security on me in your garden." "Exactly like that," Alexander smiled. "Sometimes the best thing we can do is stop and listen, even when everything tells us not." Tati, the board meeting was held in the same corporate tower where Alexander had spent so much of his life. But now, looking at the familiar faces around the table, he saw them differently. They weren't enemies or obstacles. They were people caught in the same system he had only recently escaped. "Before you start," he said, raising a hand to forestall the prepared speeches he could see in their expressions, "I want to show you something." He played a video on the conference room's large screen. It showed Isabella now able to sit up and play with Tommy, her recovery progressing beyond anyone's expectations. Then it showed other children from the shadows, their families, sharing stories of resilience and hope. Finally, it showed the community gathering to discuss plans for the new health center. "This," Alexander said into the silence that followed, "this is what real value looks like. Not stock prices or quarterly reports, but lives changed, communities lifted, hope restored." Richard Bradford, his old friend and board member, leaned forward. "Alex, we understand what you're trying to do, but there are other ways to help these people without dismantling everything we've built." "Are there?" Alexander challenged gently. "Because from where I stand, what we've built is part of the problem, but it doesn't have to be. We have the power to be part of the solution." He laid out his proposal, not just for the sale of his shares, but for a complete reimagining of the company's role in community development. The health center in the shadows would be just the beginning. As the meeting progressed, something unexpected happened. The resistance began to crack, not under pressure or threats, but under the weight of possibility. Board members who had been prepared to fight began asking questions, offering suggestions, seeing beyond the immediate crisis to the potential for real change. The transformation of the shadows began on a crisp autumn morning. Construction crews arrived to break ground on the Martinez Community Health Center, but what they found surprised them. The community had already begun preparing the site, clearing debris, marking out gardens, creating spaces for what they envisioned as their future. Elena had emerged as an unexpected leader, her years of quiet strength finding voice in organizing community meetings and coordinating volunteer efforts. The same determination that had kept her family together through their darkest times now inspired others to join the cause. "Mr. Morgan," she called out as Alexander arrived at the site, "you need to see this." She led him to a makeshift community center where dozens of residents had gathered. On the walls hung hand-drawn plans and suggestions for the health center, everything from childcare spaces to educational programs. But what caught his attention was a familiar figure among the crowd, Richard Bradford. His former board member and friend was sitting with a group of community members deep in discussion about healthcare accessibility. The corporate shark, Alexander, had known for decades was gone, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely engaged with the people around him. Richard? Alexander couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. Bradford looked up, a slightly sheepish expression on his face. "I've been doing some thinking since our last meeting. Actually, more than thinking. I've been listening." He gestured to the group around him. "Did you know that Maria Rodriguez here used to be a nurse practitioner before her credentials weren't recognized? Or that James Chen ran a successful community health program in his home country before immigrating here? There's so much expertise in this community that we've been ignoring." Alexander sat down, joining the discussion. The conversation flowed from healthcare access to job training, from medical education to community support systems. Ideas that had seemed radical in the corporate boardroom felt natural and necessary here. Tommy, who had been quietly observing from a corner, suddenly spoke up. "What about the other places, the other shadows?" The room fell silent. It was a question that had been on many minds: how to expand this model beyond one community. Bradford cleared his throat. "Actually, that's part of why I'm here. I've been talking with other board members, investors. Not everyone is against what you're doing, Alex. Some of us, well, we want to help." He pulled out his tablet, showing a list of potential partners. Other companies, foundations, even some of Alexander's former corporate rivals, all interested in supporting similar initiatives in other communities. "It's not just about charity," Bradford explained. "It's about rethinking how business can work with communities instead of around them." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice firm. "But the communities must have a voice. We know what we need better than anyone." "Exactly," Bradford agreed, surprising everyone. "That's what I've learned from watching this project. Real change has to come from within the community, not just from the top down." As the discussion continued, Alexander noticed Tommy slipping outside. He followed the boy to find him standing at the edge of the construction site, looking out. Over the shadows. "Everything's changing," Tommy said quietly. Alexander put a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Is that okay?" Tommy nodded slowly. "Isabella says the soil in your garden helped her get better. Not just the medicine, but knowing people cared enough to help." The statement hit Alexander hard. From that first morning in his garden when he'd found a desperate boy stealing soil to this moment, watching a community rise up to reshape its future, everything had changed. And yet, the essential truth remained the same. Sometimes the smallest actions could plant the seeds of the biggest changes. Inside, the meeting had evolved into an impromptu planning session. Community members and corporate executives sat side by side, barriers breaking down as they worked together to expand the vision beyond the shadows. Elena moved among them, her quiet authority guiding discussions, ensuring every voice was heard. "You've started something remarkable," Bradford said quietly, as Alexander rejoined the group. "Something that can't be stopped now, even if you wanted to." Alexander watched as Tommy returned to the room, immediately drawn into a discussion about youth programs for the health center. The boy who had once felt so alone was now surrounded by a community of support, his story becoming part of a larger narrative of change. The headlines that morning told a story few could have predicted 6 months ago. Corporate Giants Unite for Community Health Initiative. The article detailed how several major companies, led by Alexander's former board members, had committed billions to replicate the Martinez Community Health Center model across the country. But in Isabella's hospital room, the focus was on more personal victories. She was standing on her own for the first time in months, her steps wobbly but determined. Tommy hovered nearby, ready to catch her if she stumbled, while Elena recorded the moment on her phone. "Look, Mr. Morgan," Isabella called out as Alexander entered the room. "I'm dancing." Her small steps could hardly be called dancing, but the joy in her face was unmistakable. Dr. Chen, watching from the doorway, smiled. "Her recovery is exceeding all our expectations. The new treatment protocol we developed for her is already being implemented for other patients with similar conditions." Alexander nodded, thinking of the dozens of other children who would benefit from the lessons learned through Isabella's case. The hospital, facing intense public scrutiny after the interview, had undergone significant changes in leadership and policy. The new administration was working closely with the Martinez Center project, determined to right past wrongs. "Mr. Morgan," Tommy said, helping Isabella back to her bed, "can I show you something?" He pulled out a notebook filled with careful drawings and notes. Each page detailed ideas for the youth programs at the new health center, everything from art therapy to peer support groups. The boy who had once felt so powerless was now helping to shape the future of his community. "These are excellent ideas, Tommy," Alexander said, genuinely impressed. "Have you shown them to the planning committee?" Tommy nodded. Grandma says I should present them at the next community meeting." "She's right," Alexander agreed. "Your voice matters in this." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Maria, carrying a stack of papers and wearing an excited expression. "The final permits came through," she announced. "Construction can begin on the expanded facility." The news brought smiles all around. The original plans for the Martinez Center had grown significantly, incorporating suggestions from the community and lessons learned from Isabella's case. What had started as a simple health center was evolving into a comprehensive community. Elena, who had been quietly watching Isabella's impromptu dance performance, spoke up. "My daughter would be so proud," she said softly, "not just of her children, but of what her story has inspired." Alexander thought back to that first morning in his garden when he'd found Tommy collecting soil. How close he had come to simply calling security, to maintaining the walls that had kept him separate from the real world for so long. "Tommy," he said, "remember when you told me you needed the soil to bury your loved ones?" The boy nodded solemnly. "What you really did was plant something that's growing bigger than any of us imagined." Isabella, listening from her bed, reached for her brother's hand. "Like the flowers in your garden, Mr. Morgan, the ones that grow even when nobody plants them." "Exactly like that," Alexander smiled. "Sometimes the most beautiful things grow in unexpected places." Outside the hospital window, they could see the construction site of the Martinez Center. The community garden was already taking shape, with residents working together to prepare the soil for spring planting. Among them was Richard Bradford, his expensive suit traded for work clothes, learning from elderly community members about traditional growing methods. "Life has a funny way of bringing people together," Elena observed, watching the scene below. "Sometimes it takes a child's courage to make adults see what really matters." Alexander looked at Tommy, who was already back to explaining his program ideas to Isabella. The boy had done more than just challenge Alexander's worldview. He had shown him a path to redemption, not just for himself, but for an entire system that had lost its way. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital room, Alexander received another message from the project team. More communities had reached out, inspired by the Shadow's transformation. The movement was growing, spreading like wildflowers in an untended garden. Spring arrived in the Shadows with an explosion of color. The community gardens surrounding the nearly completed Martinez Center bloomed with flowers and vegetables, tended by residents who had discovered a new sense of purpose. Among them, Tommy had his own special plot, a recreation of Alexander's rooftop garden, but with a wild, untamed beauty that spoke of freedom rather than control. "Look what we harvested today," Tommy exclaimed, as he burst into Isabella's new therapy room at the center. His arms were full of fresh vegetables, and his face glowed with pride. Isabella, now strong enough for outpatient treatment, sat at a small table working with her occupational therapist. "Did you bring the purple carrots?" she asked eagerly. The garden had become a source of joy for her too, even if she could only participate from the sidelines for now. Alexander, who had been reviewing progress reports with Elena, watched the siblings' interaction with quiet satisfaction. The center was already transforming lives even before its official opening. The pilot programs they'd started in temporary facilities had shown remarkable results. "Mr. Morgan," Elena said, drawing his attention back to their discussion, "we've received more requests for program information. not just from other communities, but from hospitals and healthcare providers too. She spread out a map marked with dots representing interested parties. What had started in the shadows was spreading across the country, each community adapting the model to their own needs while maintaining the core principle: healthcare built from within, not imposed from above. The medical board wants to create a new certification program, Elena continued. They're calling it Community Integrated Healthcare. They want Tommy to speak at the first training session. Alexander raised his eyebrows. Tommy? Yes, Elena smiled. They say his perspective is crucial. The child who showed a billionaire how broken the system was. Before Alexander could respond, a commotion outside caught their attention. Through the windows, they could see a group of people gathering in the garden. At the center was Richard Bradford, but he wasn't alone. With him were several other former board members and corporate executives, all dressed casually and carrying gardening tools. The Corporate Gardening Club, Tommy explained, noticing Alexander's surprised expression. They come every week now. Mr. Bradford says it helps them remember what really matters. Alexander joined the group outside, marveling at the sight of his former colleagues kneeling in the dirt, learning from community members about sustainable growing practices. These were people who had once measured success solely in profit, margins and stock prices. It's quite a change, isn't it? Bradford said, wiping sweat from his brow. My wife says I'm a different person now. She's right, we all are. The transformation wasn't just personal. The corporate initiative they'd launched was gaining momentum, with more companies joining every week. But instead of the top-down approach they'd once favored, they were following the shadows' example, listening to communities, building from within. Inside the center, Isabella had finished her therapy session and was showing Tommy her latest achievement, walking the length of the room without support. Her progress had become a symbol of hope for other families facing similar challenges. Remember when you thought you needed soil to bury your loved ones? She asked her brother softly. But instead, you used it to help people grow. Tommy hugged his sister, careful not to overwhelm her, still recovering strength. That's because Mr. Morgan listened instead of getting angry. Alexander, overhearing their conversation, felt a familiar tightness in his throat. He thought of his own transformation, from a man isolated in his pristine rooftop garden to someone who had found purpose in the messy, beautiful reality of community. Elena approached, carrying a letter. The university wants to document our journey, she said. They say it's a model for social change, how personal stories can transform systems. Alexander took the letter, but his attention was drawn to the scene unfolding in the garden. Bradford and his fellow executives were sitting in a circle with community members, sharing a lunch of freshly harvested vegetables. The barriers of class and privilege that had once seemed so insurmountable were dissolving in the simple act of breaking bread together. We're not just building a health center, Elena observed. We're growing a new way of seeing each other. As if to emphasize her point, Isabella's voice rang out from her therapy room, calling everyone to see her latest accomplishment. The entire garden group, corporate executives and community members alike, rushed to witness her progress, united in their celebration of this small but significant victory. The day of the Martinez Community Health Center's official opening dawned, bright and clear. The building, once just an ambitious dream, now stood as a beacon of hope in the shadows. Its design, a collaboration between world-class architects and community members, merged professional healthcare facilities with welcoming community spaces. Alexander arrived early, walking through the quiet halls before the day's festivities began. The walls were adorned with artwork created by local residents, including several pieces by Isabella, who had discovered a talent for painting during her recovery. Each corridor told a story of transformation, not just of a building, but of an entire community. Everything ready for the big day? Tommy appeared beside him, dressed in a new suit that somehow didn't diminish his natural energy. Almost, Alexander smiled. Are you nervous about your speech? Tommy shrugged, but his fingers fidgeted with his tie. A little. But Grandma Elena says it's okay to be nervous when you're doing something important. The ceremony would feature several speakers, but Tommy's address was perhaps the most anticipated. The boy who had started it all by stealing soil would now help inaugurate a facility that promised to change countless lives. As the morning progressed, people began arriving, not just from the shadows, but from all over the city. Healthcare professionals mixed with community members. Corporate leaders chatted with local activists. And through it all, Elena moved with quiet authority, ensuring everyone felt welcome. Isabella, now able to walk with minimal assistance, greeted guests alongside her brother. Her recovery had become a symbol of what was possible when barriers to healthcare were removed, and communities were empowered to care for their own. "Mr. Morgan," Dr. Chen called out, excitement in her voice. "The first results from our pilot programs are in. The impact is even better than we projected." She showed him the data on her tablet. Dramatic improvements in health outcomes, reduced emergency room visits, increased preventive care participation. But more than the numbers, it was the stories behind them that mattered. Families getting the care they needed, children growing stronger, communities coming together. The ceremony began with traditional speeches from dignitaries, but the mood shifted when Tommy took the podium. He looked small behind the microphone, but his voice carried clearly through the packed auditorium. "I came to Mr. Morgan's garden because I thought I needed soil to bury my family," he began. "I was wrong. What I really needed was hope. And sometimes hope grows in the strangest places, like in a fancy garden where a rich man decides to listen instead of judge." The audience was silent, captured by the simple wisdom of his words. "This building isn't just about medicine," Tommy continued. "It's about showing that everyone matters, that every story deserves to be heard, that sometimes the best way to help people isn't to tell them what they need, but to listen when they tell you." Alexander found himself blinking back tears, and he wasn't alone. Around the room he saw similar emotions on faces both familiar and new. Bradford, sitting with his former board members, nodded in quiet agreement. Elena beamed with pride. Isabella, from her seat in the front row, gave her "Brother A, thumbs up." "My mother used to say that gardens need all kinds of plants to be healthy," Tommy concluded. "I think communities are the same way. We need everyone, doctors and patients, rich and poor, old and young. We need to grow together." The applause that followed wasn't just polite, it was thunderous, heartfelt, a recognition of truth spoken plainly. As Tommy returned to his seat, Alexander saw healthcare executives wiping away tears, community members embracing, barriers continuing to fall. After the ceremony, as people explored the new facility, Alexander found himself back in the community garden. The space had evolved far beyond his original vision, becoming a living symbol of what was possible when people worked together. "It's quite different from your rooftop garden," Eleanor said, joining him. Alexander nodded. "Better, much better." They watched as Tommy showed a group of corporate executives the vegetable plots, explaining the companion planting techniques he'd learned from community elders. Isabella sat nearby, sketching the scene for what would become another piece of artwork for the center's walls. "You know," Elena said thoughtfully, "when Tommy first told me about taking soil from your garden, I thought he was crazy. I thought you would have him arrested." "Sometimes the craziest actions lead to the most important changes," Alexander replied. "I just wish—" "No," Elena interrupted gently. "No regrets. What happened before brought us here. What matters is what we do now, how we grow from here." As if to emphasize her point, a group of medical students arrived, eager to learn about the center's innovative programs. They were part of a new initiative to train healthcare providers in community-integrated care, ensuring that the changes started here would continue to spread and grow. 6 months after the Martinez Center's opening, Alexander sat in his new office, a modest space overlooking the community garden. The wall behind his desk was covered with photos and newspaper clippings chronicling the center's impact, but his attention was focused on the letter in his hands. "Are you sure about this?" Maria asked, watching his expression carefully. She'd remained his assistant through all the changes, her role evolving along with everything else. Tommy deserves this opportunity, Alexander replied, though his voice held a mix of pride and sadness. The International Youth Leadership Program doesn't choose just anyone. The program had reached out after seeing Tommy's speech at the center's opening, which had gone viral on social media. They wanted him to join their next cohort, a year-long initiative that would take him around the world, learning from and teaching other young community leaders. Isabella's doctors say she's strong enough now, Maria noted. The new treatments have exceeded all expectations. Alexander nodded, remembering the little girl who had been too weak to walk just months ago. Now she was running through the center's halls, her artwork decorating the walls, her spirit inspiring other young patients. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Bradford, accompanied by representatives from 3 major hospital systems. Alex, Bradford's eyes were bright with excitement. Wait until you hear what they're proposing. The hospital executives laid out their plan. They wanted to implement the Martinez model across their entire networks. Not just the medical practices, but the whole approach. Community integration, preventive care, social support systems. We've been doing it wrong for years, one executive admitted, trying to impose solutions from above instead of building them from within. As they discussed details, Alexander noticed movement in the garden below. Tommy was there with a group of medical students, teaching them about the healing properties of various plants. The boy who had once felt so alone was now becoming a teacher, a leader in his own right. The program starts in 3 months, Bradford said softly, noticing where Alexander's attention had gone. Have you told him yet? Not yet. Elena knows. We've been discussing the arrangements. The arrangements were complex. Tommy would travel with a program mentor, while Elena and Isabella would remain at the center, where Isabella's ongoing treatment and recovery would continue. Alexander had promised to be their guardian in Tommy's absence, a commitment that felt both daunting and natural. Later that afternoon, Alexander found Tommy in the garden, tending to a special plot of flowers, the same varieties from Alexander's old rooftop garden. These are almost ready to bloom, Tommy said without looking up. Just like in your garden, but different somehow. Wilder, more free. Alexander sat on a nearby bench, patting the space beside him. Tommy, there's something we need to discuss. The boy joined him, his eyes knowing. It's about the program, isn't it? I found the letter in Grandma Eleanor's room. What do you think about it? Tommy was quiet for a moment, his fingers playing with a leaf from one of the plants. I want to go, he finally said. I want to learn how to help more people, but you're worried about Isabella and your grandmother. Yeah, after everything that happened, I don't want to leave them. Alexander turned to face the boy directly. Tommy, do you remember what you said in your speech about how gardens need all kinds of plants to be healthy? Tommy nodded. Well, sometimes plants need to spread their seeds far and wide to help new gardens grow. What you've helped create. Here it's important, but there are other communities out there that could learn from your experience. Would you take care of them? Tommy asked, his voice small but steady. Isabella and Grandma Elena? With all my heart, Alexander promised. And you'll be able to talk to them every day. The program has it all arranged. Tommy looked out, over the garden, where Isabella was walking with her physical therapist stronger every day. Near the center's entrance, Elena was greeting a group of community members arriving for a health education class. Mom would want me to go, he said, finally. She always said education was the key to changing things. Alexander felt his throat tighten. She was right, and you've already proven that one person can create huge changes. Not alone, Tommy corrected him. We did it together. All of us. They sat there watching the life flowing through the garden and center. Alexander marveled at how far they'd come from that first morning when he'd found a desperate boy stealing soil. The changes had rippled out far beyond anything either of them could have imagined, touching lives across the city, and now, potentially, around the world. The news of Tommy's selection for the International Youth Leadership Program spread through the shadows like wildfire. The community, which had come to see Tommy as a symbol of their collective potential, responded with a mixture of pride and protective concern. "We should have a celebration," Elena announced during the weekly community council meeting, not just for Tommy, but for everything he represents. The idea quickly evolved into something bigger, a community festival that would showcase everything the Martinez Center had achieved. It would be a chance to demonstrate how far they'd come and a platform to launch their next phase of growth. Isabella took charge of the artistic elements, working with other young patients to create installations that told their stories of healing and hope. Her own recovery had inspired many, and her artwork had become a form of therapy for others facing similar challenges. "Look, Mr. Morgan," she called out, showing him a massive collage she was creating. "It's everyone's story together." The piece was remarkable. Photographs, drawings, and written testimonials woven together to show the center's impact. At its heart was a simple image, a handful of soil sprouting with new life. As preparations for the festival continued, Alexander noticed Tommy spending extra time in the garden, especially in his special plot of flowers. One evening, he found the boy carefully collecting seeds from various plants. "What are you planning?" Alexander asked, though he thought he knew. "Seeds for other gardens," Tommy replied, "for the places I'll visit, so they can grow something beautiful too." The idea caught on quickly. Soon, other community members were contributing seeds from their own garden plots, each variety carefully labeled with its story and significance. It became a physical representation of how ideas could spread and take root in new soil. The day before the festival, Elena called a special meeting in the center's main hall. The room was packed with people whose lives had been touched by the changes of the past year. Patients, healthcare workers, community members, and even some of the corporate executives who had become regular volunteers. "Tomorrow we celebrate," Elena began. "But today I want us to remember how this all started, with a boy who was desperate enough to steal soil from a rich man's garden, and a man who was wise enough to listen instead of judge." There were tears in many eyes as she continued. "Some might say it was chance that brought them together. I say it was something more, a reminder that when we open our hearts to others' pain, we open the door to healing for everyone." Bradford, who had become a fixture at the center, stood up. "I was one of the people who initially opposed Alexander's changes," he admitted. "I thought he was having some sort of breakdown. Now I realize he was finally waking up, and he helped wake up the rest of us too." As the meeting continued, Alexander watched Tommy moving through the crowd, greeting people, sharing memories, making connections. The boy had grown so much, not just in height, but in confidence and purpose. The scared child who had broken into his garden was now a young leader, preparing to take his message to the world. Isabella sat beside her brother, her strength evident in the way she moved, her spirit shining in her smile. She had become a different kind of leader, using her art and her story to help others find their voice. "You know," Elena said softly, joining Alexander's observation, "when Tommy first told me about the international program, I was afraid. After everything we've been through, the idea of him being so far away." "But," Alexander prompted gently, "but then I remembered what my daughter always said, that change requires courage. Tommy showed courage that morning in your garden. Now it's our turn to show courage by letting him spread his wings." The evening wound down with a spontaneous gathering in the garden. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the blooming flowers and thriving vegetables, people shared stories of transformation, personal, professional, communal. Alexander found himself sitting on his favorite bench, watching as Tommy taught a group of younger children about seed saving and plant care. The boy's voice was clear and confident, his teachings a blend of scientific knowledge and personal experience. "The soil remembers," Tommy was saying. "It remembers what we give it, what we take from it. But most importantly, it remembers how we care for it. That's true for people too." The community festival transformed the Martinez Center and its surroundings into a vibrant celebration of life and possibility. Food stalls offered dishes from every culture represented in the shadows, while music and dance performances created a constant backdrop of joyful noise. But the real heart of the celebration was the stories being shared. In the main hall, a multimedia exhibition coordinated by Isabella showcased the center's journey. Visitors moved through a series of installations, each telling a different part of the story, from the desperate beginnings to the flourishing present. At the center was a simple glass case containing a small amount of soil from Alexander's original garden, preserved as a reminder of where it all began. "It's strange," Isabella said, standing beside Alexander as they watched people interact with the exhibits. "That soil was supposed to be for sadness, but it ended up bringing so much life instead." Alexander squeezed her shoulder gently. She had grown stronger, not just physically, but emotionally too. Her art therapy program had become one of the center's most successful initiatives, helping other children process their own healing journeys. Outside, Tommy was leading tours of the garden, which had expanded far beyond its original boundaries. The once empty lots surrounding the center had been transformed into a patchwork of vegetable gardens, healing herb collections and flower beds. Each plot told its own story of transformation. "And these," Tommy explained to a group of visiting healthcare administrators, "are our seed-saving gardens. We're creating a library of life that other communities can use to start their own healing spaces." The administrators, many of whom had initially been skeptical of the center's community-based approach, were now taking careful notes. The success of the Martinez model, as it had come to be known, was impossible to ignore. Elena, watching from nearby, felt a familiar ache in her heart. In just 3 weeks, Tommy would be leaving for his international program. Though she knew it was an incredible opportunity, the thought of him being so far away still scared her. "He'll be fine," Alexander said softly, reading her expression. "He's stronger than any of us realized." "It's not just strength," Elena replied, "it's wisdom. He understands things that took me a lifetime to learn." Their conversation was interrupted by Bradford, who arrived with an unexpected guest: the city's mayor. The political establishment, which had initially viewed the Martinez Center with skepticism, was now eager to support its expansion. "We are prepared to offer full backing for 3 more centers," the mayor announced, cameras flashing around her. Each one built on the Martinez model of community integration and participatory healthcare. But it was what she said next that caught everyone by surprise. "Furthermore, we're establishing the Martinez Fellowship Program. Each year, 10 young leaders from underserved communities will receive full scholarships for medical school or healthcare administration training. The first fellowship will be named in honor of Tommy Martinez." Tommy, who had been listening from the edge of the crowd, stepped forward. His eyes were wide with emotion. "But why my name?" The mayor smiled. "Because you showed us that sometimes the most important healthcare innovations don't come from laboratories or boardrooms. They come from the heart of the communities we serve." As the announcement settled over the crowd, Alexander noticed Isabella slipping away to her art room. He followed, finding her at work on a new piece, a large canvas filled with spiraling patterns of growth and connection. "It's for Tommy," she explained, not looking up from her work, "to remind him of home while he's away." Alexander watched her paint, marveling at how her hands, once too weak to hold a brush, now moved with confidence and purpose. The swirling patterns reminded him of DNA helixes, of growing vines, of lives, intertwined and transformed. "Do you think he'll change out there?" Isabella asked suddenly, voicing the fear they all carried. "Yes," Alexander answered honestly, "but change isn't always bad. Look how much we've all changed since that morning in my garden." Isabella nodded, adding another layer to her painting. "Mom used to say that change is like the seasons. It can be hard, but it brings new life." Outside, the festival continued, a living testament to the power of that change. The shadows, once a place people tried to escape from, had become a destination, a model of what was possible when communities were empowered to heal themselves. As the festival wound down and the crowds began to thin, Tommy found himself back in his special garden plot. The evening air was cool, carrying the mingled scents of flowers and herbs. He knelt down, running his fingers through the soil, so different from the pristine earth he'd tried to steal from Alexander's garden. All those months ago. "I thought I'd find you here," Alexander said, approaching quietly. "Your grandmother is looking for you. There are some people from the international program who want to discuss your travel arrangements." Tommy nodded, but didn't move immediately. "Mr. Morgan, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you sure I'm ready for this? To go out there and try to help other places do what we did here?" Alexander sat on the garden bench, patting the space beside him, a gesture that had become familiar over their many conversations. "Do you remember what you told me about the soil that first morning?" "That I needed it to bury my family," Tommy replied softly. "But that wasn't really what you needed, was it? You needed someone to listen, to understand, to help make things right. And now you're going to be that person for others." Inside the center, they could hear Isabella's voice leading a group in one of her art therapy sessions. Her strength had returned in ways none of the doctors had predicted, her spirit inspiring others to find their own paths to healing. "The program director says I'll visit 12 countries, Tommy said, his voice a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Each one has communities like the Shadows, places where people need help but nobody's listening. And you'll listen," Alexander assured him. "You'll show them what's possible when people work together, when barriers come down, when healing becomes a community effort." Elena appeared at the garden entrance, a warm smile on her face. "There you are, mi amor. The program coordinators are waiting. They have something special to show you." In the conference room, a group of international healthcare leaders had gathered. On a large screen, they displayed a map dotted with lights, each one representing a community that had expressed interest in the Martinez model. "These are just the beginning," one of the coordinators explained. "Your story has sparked a movement, Tommy. People are realizing that true healthcare has to come from within communities, not just from institutions." Bradford, who had stayed for the presentation, added his own perspective. "When Alexander first started this project, many of us thought it was impractical, maybe even impossible. Now look, it's becoming a global model for community health transformation." Tommy studied the map, his eyes moving from point to point. Each light represented people like his family, communities like the Shadows, all waiting for someone to listen, to understand, to help make things right. "See this?" The coordinator pointed to a cluster of lights in Southeast Asia. "These communities have already started their own gardens, inspired by your story. They're waiting to learn from you." Isabella, who had slipped into the room quietly, moved to stand beside her brother. "You'll need to take seeds," she said matter-of-factly, "seeds from our garden so they can grow their own." "And pictures," Elena added. "Pictures of what we've built here to show them what's possible." Alexander watched the family interact, remembering how close they had come to being torn apart by a broken system. Now they were helping to fix that system, not just for themselves, but for others around the world. "Tommy," he said, drawing the boy's attention, "your mother's dream for a better future. You're making it real, not just for your family, but for families everywhere." The mention of his mother brought tears to Tommy's eyes, but they were different from the tears of that desperate morning in the garden. These were tears of hope, of purpose, of understanding that sometimes the greatest transformations grow from the darkest moments. Outside, the last rays of sunlight painted the community garden in shades of gold. The flowers Tommy had planted, the same varieties from Alexander's old garden, swayed gently in the evening breeze, their seeds ready to spread and take root in new soil. The morning of Tommy's departure arrived with a gentle sunrise that painted the shadows in soft, promising colors. The community had gathered in the Martinez Center's garden, where every plant and flower seemed to stand a little taller, as if offering their own farewell to the boy who had helped bring them into being. Isabella had spent the night completing her farewell gift, a series of paintings that chronicled their journey, from that desperate morning in Alexander's garden to the flourishing present. Each piece was small enough to fit in Tommy's travel bag, a portable reminder of home and hope. "One for each month you'll be away," she explained, carefully wrapping them in protective paper. "So you'll always have a piece of us with you." Rena moved through the garden, gathering specific herbs and flowers with practiced hands. "For tea," she said, creating small sachets, "to help you sleep in strange places, to remind you of our garden." Alexander watched these preparations from his office window, his own emotions a complex mixture of pride and protective concern. The past year had transformed them all, but perhaps Tommy most of all. The desperate boy who had come to steal soil had become a young leader preparing to share his wisdom with the world. "The car will be here in an hour," Maria reminded him gently. "The first group of medical students has already arrived for the farewell ceremony." Indeed, the garden was filling with people, not just community members, but healthcare professionals, civic leaders, and students who had been touched by the Martinez Center's work. Bradford arrived with several other former board members, each carrying small gifts for Tommy's journey. "Remember when we thought this was all a crisis to be managed?" Bradford mused, joining Alexander at the window. "Now look, it's becoming a global movement." The Martinez model had already been adopted by communities in 3 different countries, with more preparing to implement it. Tommy's international program would take him to each of these places, allowing him to share his unique perspective on community-driven healthcare transformation. As the morning progressed, Tommy made his way through the crowd, accepting hugs, advice, and well wishes. He moved with a quiet confidence that reminded Alexander of Elena, the same steady strength, the same deep understanding of what really mattered. "Mr. Morgan," Tommy's voice drew him from his thoughts, "can we visit the old garden one last time?" The request surprised Alexander. He had largely forgotten about his rooftop sanctuary, having found a truer sense of peace in the community garden below. But he understood Tommy's need for closure, for returning to where it all began. They took the private elevator to the penthouse level, stepping out into the immaculately maintained space that now felt strangely foreign. The garden was still beautiful, but its perfection seemed hollow compared to the vibrant community-tended spaces they'd created in the shadows. "It looks smaller," Tommy observed, running his hand along a marble planter. "And different. Everything looks different when we change how we see," Alexander replied. "When I found you here that morning, I thought I was seeing a problem to be solved. Instead, I was seeing a teacher who would help me understand what really matters." Tommy smiled, kneeling to touch the soil he had once tried to steal. "It's still good soil," he said thoughtfully. "But now I know it's not the soil that matters most, it's what we choose to grow in it." From this height, they could see the Martinez Center below, its gardens spreading out like a green oasis in the urban landscape. People moved through the spaces, tending plants, attending outdoor therapy sessions, building community one interaction at a time. "I'm scared," Tommy admitted quietly. "Not of traveling or meeting new people. I'm scared I won't be able to help them the way they need." Alexander knelt beside him, their hands touching the same soil that had brought them together. "You know what I've learned from you, Tommy? Help doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes it's just about being there, listening, showing people they're not alone." A message from Maria buzzed on Alexander's phone. The car had arrived. It was time. As they descended to rejoin the others, Tommy took one last look at the rooftop garden. "Thank you," he said simply, "for listening." That day, Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you," he replied, "for teaching me how to listen." The farewell ceremony in the Martinez Center's garden was both an ending and a beginning. Community members had created a circle of chairs around Tommy's special garden plot, where the flowers he had planted, mirrors of Alexander's rooftop garden, bloomed with wild, unfettered beauty. Isabella, stronger than ever, stood beside her brother, their hands clasped tightly. Elena sat nearby, her face a canvas of emotions, pride, love, and the bittersweet understanding that sometimes growth requires separation. "Before Tommy leaves," Alexander announced, "we have something to share." Maria and Bradford helped unveil a new installation at the garden's entrance, a plaque that told the story of a desperate boy, a handful of soil, and the transformation that followed. But it wasn't just a historical marker, It was an invitation for others to begin their own journeys of change. Tommy read the plaque's final words aloud: "From this soil grows hope. Every garden begins with a single seed. Every change begins with a single action. What will you grow?" The gathered crowd, community members, healthcare workers, corporate leaders, and students, listened in respectful silence. Many of them had been part of this story, had witnessed or contributed to the changes that had transformed not just the shadows, but their own understanding of what was possible. "Tommy," Elena spoke, her voice strong and clear, "your mother would be so proud. Not because you're leaving to help others, but because you never stopped believing in the power of growth and change." Isabella stepped forward, presenting her brother with one final gift, a sketchbook filled with blank pages. "For drawing. The new gardens you'll help create," she explained, "so we can see them when you come home." The moment of departure approached. Tommy shouldered his backpack, filled with seeds from the community garden, Isabella's paintings, Eleanor's herb sachets, and the hopes of an entire community. The international program coordinator waited discreetly by the car. "Remember," Alexander said softly, "you're not going alone. You're carrying all of us with you, every lesson, every story, every moment of transformation." Tommy nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then he turned to address the gathered crowd. "When I came to Mr. Morgan's garden that morning, I thought I had lost everything, but what I really found was a beginning. That's what I want to share with others, not just how to build health centers or grow gardens, but how to find beginnings in their darkest moments." Elena embraced her grandson, whispering prayers and blessings. Isabella hugged him fiercely, their bond stronger than any distance could challenge. Alexander watched, remembering the desperate child who had broken into his garden, seeing now the leader he had become. As Tommy walked toward the waiting car, he stopped suddenly and turned back. Running to his garden plot, he knelt and scooped a handful of soil into a small container he pulled from his pocket. "A reminder," he explained to Alexander's questioning look, "not of where I started, but of how far we can go when we grow together." The car pulled away, carrying Tommy toward his next chapter. But in the garden, his presence remained, in the flowers he had planted, in the lives he had touched, in the changes he had inspired. Alexander felt Eleanor's hand slip into his. "He'll be fine," she said softly. "Yes," Alexander agreed, "and so will we." They stood together in the garden, watching as community members began their daily activities, tending plants, attending therapy sessions, building connections. The Martinez Center hummed with life and purpose, a testament to the power of listening, of caring, of believing in the possibility of change. Isabella returned to her art room, where students waited for their therapy session. Elena moved to welcome a new family arriving for their first visit to the center. Alexander watched them all, these people who had become his true family, who had taught him the real meaning of growth and transformation. In his pocket, he felt the small bag of soil Tommy had given him that morning, a final gift taken from the garden they had created together. Not stolen this time, but freely given, a reminder that the most precious things in life are those we nurture together. The garden bloomed on, a living testament to the truth they had all discovered,